Hi, I'm Erik Olson. I'm a lead program manager on Microsoft's ASP.NET team. I work on the ASP.NET engine, specifically on things relating to web application security, performance, scalability, process model, and the health and robustness of web servers. I enjoy specifically topics that relate to web application security and managed code security. Today we're going to be talking about a concept in web applications called impersonation. Impersonation is a concept that lets a server application run in the security context of a client application. So as an example, I might have a browser. It might be running as the Alice account, and it authenticates to a web server. The web server might run as its own service account, or it might choose to run as Alice. This is called impersonation. Now there are kind of an array of options and details associated with impersonation. How does it work on the local machine is one particular key, and then how does it work when I'm trying to access remote resources is another one. So we'll walk through a table of options that describes the various ASP.NET configuration options, what happens when you configure things a certain way on the web server, and then if you're trying to access a remote system, say a database server or a file server or some other kind of data to your system, how do you get the identity to flow or use a service identity to talk to that back-end system? So we'll talk about all the various pieces there and let you know where your application is running as, who your application is running as, in what context. Let's take a look at some of the configuration options for ASP.NET that govern the identity of the thread and the process, and we'll talk about how they play out in different scenarios. The two configuration sections that I want to point out are the process model section. This exists at machine scope and is really only used on IIS 5. On IIS 6, you control the identity of the process itself using the INET Manager and the IIS Metabase. So the process model selects the account used to run the entire web process. The second section that we'll talk about is identity. This is a section that controls per client impersonation or lets you run things with a specific impersonation account. So basically this controls the identity of the thread used to process a given request. So what I'd like to do is look at a little diagram here where I've got a client system, and let's say that this is a web browser. I've got two web servers, an IIS 5 web server and an IIS 6 web server. And in some cases these will behave a little bit differently, so I want to call them out independently. And then I've got some kind of a data component here on a back-end system that might be a database, a file server, business logic server, or whatever. And we'll talk about the identity at the web server and at the data tier, and with the various configuration options and what the difference is. So let's start by looking at the default setting for impersonation in ASP.NET, which is identity impersonate equal false. And what this means is, in effect, run with the process account. So if we go to our diagram and we look at the client application making a request, on IIS 5, by default, we'll be running with a local account created when the .NET Frameworks is installed called the ASP.NET account. This is, again, a local account that doesn't have permissions on the network. And so my entire request will be executing with the ASP.NET account. On IIS 6, I have a similar situation, but I'll use a built-in account by default called Network Service. Network Service has one very nice property, which is that it has network credentials as the machine when the machine belongs to a domain. So walking through the causality here, my client comes to this machine on IIS 5, and when I try to go to the back end, I'm going to leave the machine as the anonymous account, and I'm likely going to get access denied on the back end unless I've configured something to allow for that. On IIS 6, assuming that both machines belong to a domain, when I go to the back end, I will show up as the machine account. So on a machine named WebA, the account name will be WebA$, and I can configure access for my database or file server or whatever it is for this particular machine account. So that's a nice option if I want to authenticate my machine to a remote data access or service component in some way. So if we look at our table here, on the web server itself, we run as the process account. When we hit the remote machine, we are either the anonymous account, the machine account if running as network service on IIS 6, or if we have changed the default identity to a domain account or a local account that exists on both machines, then I'll have that identity when I go across the network. And as an example, let's say I've got a domain named corp and I want to be able to use a domain account in both places, I can configure the web process to run as the corp, let's call it data account, and then I'll be able to run as that account when I go to talk to the remote data store. So there's a couple of different options there if I'm not impersonating, but in effect I'm running as the process identity, and then when I leave the machine, whether or not I have network credentials depends on the identity that I'm running the process as. So that's probably the simplest case. It's the default one, and it's one used by a lot of people to build kind of trusted subsystems. I'll do my authentication and authorization up front inside of the web application, and then when I go talk to the back-end data store, I'll do it as the service account or as the application itself. That lets me get maximal use of my connection pool because I only have one identity going off to the back end, and it also makes it easy for me to build things because I know exactly who's going to be accessing my back-end data stores and resources. So let's move on to the next option, which is identity impersonate equal true. And I'm going to call this client impersonation. And what it means is that on the web server, I'll be running as the client of the request. Now that might be an authenticated user, or it might be an anonymous user, something like the iUser machine name, if I've turned off authentication. So that's the security context on the web server itself. Now when I go to leave the machine, one of a couple different things can happen. The first thing is that I might be using an authentication protocol that's not what we call delegatable. So impersonation means I run on the web server with the remote identity of the client. Now, a second concept is called delegation, and that means taking that identity and using it to leave the machine and access network resources also as that user that I'm impersonating. This is, of course, a more privileged kind of concept because I'm not only my user on the machine, I'm taking that identity onto the network and doing additional things with it. So only certain kinds of authentication protocols support delegation. One of them is basic authentication, and this is simply because it's not a very good authentication protocol. It sends the username and password to the web server, and so the web server can do a logon as that user, and because it has the credentials, it can leave the machine as that user. So basic auth works for delegation. If you use it, you should always use it over SSL or an equivalent mechanism to make sure that the integrity and privacy of those credentials is preserved during transmission. A much better authentication protocol is Kerberos, and it also supports delegation if the domain is configured to support that. So for example, I have to allow delegation for the machines and the set of accounts that I'm talking about. And if that's true, then I can delegate or take those credentials on the web server and use them to access the backend as the user that I've authenticated. A common thing to do for applications that either use anonymous access or they're using some sort of forms-based authentication is to configure the anonymous account to run as a particular security context. So going back to our earlier example, let's say that we'd like to access the backend with this corp/data account. I might go configure this account as the anonymous user in IIS and then simply turn impersonation on in ASP.NET. Because I'm not doing Windows authentication, I will always be running as the anonymous account, which in this case I've set to be corp data, and when I go off to the back end, I will be going with that context. So that's also a good way to get to back-end network resources if I'm not using Windows authentication on the web server, kind of an internet scenario. Let's talk about the third option now, which is explicit impersonation of a given account. ASP.NET supports configuring a certain set of credentials that I want to use for a given resource, given application or request. This has to be an account that I configure in the configuration file. If you're going to use this, ASP.NET has shipped a tool called ASP.NET setreg.exe, and it lets you take the credentials, encrypt them, and put them in a registry key that's protected with a particular ACL. This is 1,000,000 times better than putting them clear text in the configuration file. And so just as a security note here, if you're going to use this option, make sure to download that tool. You can get it for free from the support site and use that to protect the credentials that you're going to use. In this case, when I leave the machine, I will be leaving as the account I've configured in this section. It will either have network credentials if it's a domain account or is an identical local account. Otherwise, it will have anonymous credentials. So let's talk about the last and final option here that we're going to discuss today, which is what happens if my application itself lives on a UNC share or a network access device. When you create an application root in IIS mapped to a UNC share, you need to provide a set of credentials that the application uses to access the share with. If I'm running as a local service account, say the ASP.NET account, I can't get to the share to read the content because I don't have network permissions. And so when you create the site or directory using iNet Manager, you'll specify a set of credentials, and ASP.NET will use those to run the request. And so normally, when you are on a UNC share, you will be using the UNC account not only to run the request, but when you go off the box to talk to a back-end resource. This works the same way as the process and explicit impersonation accounts that we've seen before, in that if this account is a domain account or a local account that also exists on the target machine, I'll have those network credentials. Otherwise, I have anonymous credentials on the network. So let's summarize some of the options that we've talked about today. We can choose to use the default setting in ASP.NET, which is to run everything with the process identity. When I do this, I have a single stable identity, and whether or not I can use that to access off-the-box resources depends on the account that I'm using and whether or not I'm using IIS-6 and network service. I can enable impersonation of the client, which means that whatever the request is, that's how we'll run. So if you're using authentication, you'll be running as the authenticated user. If you're using anonymous requests, it will be as the anonymous user. Again, whether or not you can access back-end resources that way depends on whether or not your authentication protocol is delegatable or if you've configured an anonymous account with network identity. Alternatively, I can use an explicit impersonation account after appropriately protecting the credentials in order to go and talk to a back-end resource. And I should also remember that if my application lives on a UNC share, that the account that I use to specify, the account that I specified for IIS for the network credentials is what my application will run as.